Out of all the Demon Slayer Hashira who we've been introduced to, Giyu Tomioka is one of the characters who has one of the most interesting templates for a character that make you gravitate towards him each time you reread the series. He's got layers for a character who we've gone stretches without seeing for very long periods of time, but his character is written in a way to where his character arc and the tragedies that he's had to overcome rank him near the top of the franchise in terms of how well written he is, which is telling given that he doesn't even have the saddest origin story in the franchise, but he easily has one of the more well-presented backgrounds, which explains a lot of his character's mannerisms and his actions. Whereas someone like Mitsuri Kanroji is a great example of someone trying to change themselves to win the approval of others, to becoming someone who learned to love themselves and everything about them that many people will find as faults. Giyu is a perfect example of survivor's guilt, and that it's not something that is black and white, but instead it has layers to it that only become crystal clear when you begin to study his character, his mannerisms, and most importantly, his character interactions. Survivor's guilt is defined as being a state when someone has feelings of guilt because they survived a life-threatening situation when others did not. At least in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, some researchers say that if it's left unaddressed, it can lead to long-term emotional distress and could even lead to suicidal thoughts. With Giyu, like anyone else who suffered from survivor's guilt, they find themselves going back to a point in their lives which is going to be the trigger point where they believe that they themselves should have died. For Giyu, survivor's guilt hit him not just once but twice, and in both cases they play a role in his character arc and in the franchise interactions that he has with different characters. Back when Giyu took the final selection test and ended up being saved by his friend Sabito, who while Giyu was knocked out and left injured had killed numerous demons before the exam before dying himself, Giyu found himself saying that he was inferior to Sabito and thinking that he was undeserving of the title of being a Hashira for that reason. This turning point moment for Giyu is what makes his character so fascinating, and after you learn about his origin story, when you go back and you reread the series, it makes this introduction hit home that much harder. His sister Sutako gave her life to protect him from demons, an older sibling willing to go to the afterlife to ensure that the younger sibling would live. When we first meet him in the series, we see him attempting to kill Nezuko, the younger sibling of Tanjiro, and we see as how Tanjiro desperately tries to defend his younger sister. We see a hint of wavering in Giyu's heart as his interaction continues, and we see the walls around his heart continue to come down even further when he notices that Nezuko is protecting Tanjiro. That moment in hindsight for us as readers was a moment we clearly see how he found himself thinking about how his own older sister protected him from being killed by demons. When he saw Tanjiro, he saw someone, though albeit through a different means, he saw someone who survived just like he did. That was partly why he told him to stop crying, and he had his internal monologue that he knew about the pain that Tanjiro was feeling in his heart, and because on the second time going through the series, we as readers have knowledge of why Giyu is acting the way that he does, it makes that whole dynamic between these two feel that much more investing for us as readers. On a second reread of the series, one could say that Giyu also thought ahead to what might even await Tanjiro if he tried to tell people what happened to his family and to his sister, given that the frantic state he was in. Just as people didn't believe Giyu, they wouldn't have believed Tanjiro if he ever told them the truth, because demon existence wasn't common knowledge to the general public. The decision to have Tanjiro go train with Urokodaki is another interesting thing upon rereading the series, because we know that Giyu eventually wanted Tanjiro to replace him as the Water Hashira because he found himself being undeserving. Tanjiro grabbed his attention by the way he first tried to protect his younger sister Nezuko, but also the way he was willing to give his life to do so, and he planned out an attack with his axe hoping to take Giyu down well after Tanjiro anticipated that he'd be cut down by Giyu's katana. The first act reminded him of his sister. The second act likely made him think of Sabuto, someone who had immense potential that never got realized because he died so soon. These two actions likely triggered some survivor's guilt in Giyu, and the idea to have Tanjiro train to become a demon slayer goes back to the premise that he could one day replace him as a water Hashira. The intent was hopefully that Tanjiro reaches his full potential, unlike Sabuto who never got a chance, and can have Giyu's place amongst the 9 pillars because Giyu himself felt he was unworthy. This hits home even harder when you break down his name. Giyu means volunteer, heroism, loyalty, and courage. The surname means enriched, wealthy, and abundant for the Tomi part of his name, and the Oka part of his name means rich hill. So when we take the meanings of his name and look at his character, look at what we get here. Volunteer, enrich, and hill. Each word fits into his interactions and his motives to Tanjiro and the relationship. He volunteered by saving Tanjiro and placing his name and his life on the line to the Demon Slayer Corps. Giyu believed in them being different, and Nezuko Nezuko being worth saving, and that Tanjiro needed to be a demon slayer, knowing that if it ever came to a point where he was proven wrong about Nezuko, he'd have to give up his life as he promised. Enrich came from the fact that he enriched Tanjiro by having him train with Urokodaki to train in the art of demon slayer and water breathing, and all the times we've seen the two interact where Giyu appeared to be helping Tanjiro in his own way and serving as a hill that Tanjiro would eventually have to climb. And when he did reach the top of that symbolic hill, Giyu planned for him to take his spot as the water Hashira. The small details like that really make you appreciate the character more, but it's also a glimpse into his psyche because it shows even in the years after his sister's death and the death of Sabuto, the survivor's guilt is still there and he still feels somewhat undeserving. Despite his sister and Sabuto telling him otherwise by their actions, the beauty becomes even clearer when we see how Giyu eventually finds that peace that comes from accepting that he was a survivor, but that his life isn't meaningless and that the people who gave their lives to him saw potential in his life. That also makes you look at his name different when you consider the role that Tanjiro played in making him see the truth, because Tanjiro essentially enriched his soul by playing the role that he did and getting him to see the value in his life, which goes back to the Tomi portion of his name. To take the character from feeling as if he's unworthy for the sacrifices people made to ensure that he lived, and to have him survive into the final battle and turn around and be so quick to show the courage needed to attack Demon King Tanjiro when he bit Nezuko, is why this is so important, because it shows that he's gotten over that survivor's guilt briefly and was trying to stop Tanjiro from losing the light of his soul by trying to attack him when he himself went after Nezuko. Another thing about Giyu and his journey to overcome the survivor's guilt is the way that it didn't just weigh him down mentally as mental luggage that he carried around, believing that he should have died, and that every time he entered into the battle, it pained him because he felt as if a true swordsman worthy of the title Water Hashira should be fighting and not himself. But we also see him physically carry around that guilt as well. He's a man torn between two sacrifices. On one side, he has a solid pattern on his clothing, red like the blood that his sister spilled to protect him. On the other side, we have the multi-pattern layered design similar to the one that Sabuto had. This further becomes a huge sign when we look at the final battle for Giyu, where when he does go to attack Tanjiro, the pattern side after Sabuto is covered in blood as he's trying to attack Tanjiro. It's a blemish, but it's again symbolic because it's him trying to do what couldn't be done before. He was the one who had been protected in the past. Tanjiro had helped him see the value in the sacrifices made for him, and the blood on that cloak side represents Sabuto. When he tries to stop Tanjiro from fully attacking Nezuko, it goes back to this because he viewed Tanjiro as being a demon slayer worthy of filling the role of Hashira that Giyu felt that Sabuto would have earned. Blood was shed for him in the past. Now his own blood was being patterned on the side to remember Sabuto symbolically, and him trying to stop Tanjiro showed that he had fully moved into the role of being willing to take the sacrifice for the life that is needed, bringing him full circle and the relationship with Tanjiro full circle as well. This is why when he does think Tanjiro's dead, that's the whole reason why Giyu has that breakdown that he does have. Whereas when we first see Giyu when he meets Tanjiro and is telling him not to be defenseless in front of the enemy and to man up and to stop crying, he's so shaken with anger here because Tanjiro and Nezuko remind him of his sister saving him and dying to do so. With survivor's guilt, those feelings can turn into anger, and we see that with Giyu in the first chapter of the manga. However, we know that this is out of character for him to be this angry because when you see him in the future arcs, he has a lot of emotions. However, none of those emotions are truly anger. Not in the way that we saw in this first chapter. It's not an overwhelming emotion that you'd associate with Giyu's character. In the final volume of the manga, volume 23, we see him at one point at Tanjiro's back trying to support him, a fitting way to bring him full circle because whereas in volume 1, we open up with Giyu saving Tanjiro and his sister, Tanjiro by the events of volume 23 has saved Giyu from himself, because when we got that moment long before that where Tanjiro reminded him of the promise that he made to Sabuto to continue living and don't disrespect the deaths of those who died to protect you and protect and preserve your life, this is what makes Tanjiro and Giyu landing one of the final blows on Muzan when they work together feel so earned, because these two enriched each other through different means, and Giyu, who started the series off with survivor's guilt, is now beginning to start moving past it, and moving past it in the sense that he's helping deliver the final blow on Muzan, who is the center for a lot of the pain of all of the demon slayers. He's learned what it means to live. He's learned that to live is to suffer, but to survive, that's to find meaning into that suffering. And for Giyu, that meaning is what Tanjiro reminded him of, to not disrespect the sacrifices made by others for his survival, and by helping Tanjiro with one of the decisive blows on Muzan, he was paying back all those sacrifices made for him and paying back Tanjiro for helping him find meaning into his life and find meaning into his suffering. However, there's one final thing done to show that he's risen above survivor's guilt. It's to have him be protected by Tanjiro when Muzan sucks him in, and we see Giyu rise above it by not wallowing in his despair, though he does shed tears and he blames himself immediately after it happens. But the moment he sees Tanjiro's demon instincts kicking in, he's trying to pay back the sacrifice Tanjiro made for him, and we see Giyu, the boy who had been protected by his sacrifice so many times in the story before, actually play a critical role in saving the person in Tanjiro who actually saved him. Hopefully this video helps you see why I love Giyu's character so much. He's a character who I think the more times you go through the story, the more better written his character actually seems to you. That being said, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out these other Demon Slayer videos. You still